My daughter-in-law screamed, "I don't want a useless old woman here while I'm pregnant." My son just agreed and said, "Don't be selfish, Mom, and don't be dramatic." So I moved out. The next weekend, the new landlord was at their door, and what he said to them made them call me non-stop. Before we continue, I just want to say thank you for taking the time to hear my story. If you're comfortable, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now let me tell you my story. My name is Patricia Hayes. For 42 years my world was one of systems. As a hospital administrator, I dealt in protocols and contracts, both written and implied. My job was to ensure the system worked, to identify points of failure, and to implement solutions with a calm, methodical precision that left no room for error. This is the story of a system I built, not for an institution but for my family. It was a social contract, the most important one I ever had, and it was based on love. This is the story of what happened when that contract was willfully, brutally, and unforgivably broken, forcing me to abandon the soft, forgiving language of family and revert to the cold, clear and unyielding logic of a legally binding agreement. The final, catastrophic system failure occurred on a Saturday afternoon in late August. The air was thick and heavy with the promise of a coming thunderstorm, and the atmosphere inside the duplex I owned was just as charged. The battleground was the garden, my last remaining refuge. I was tending to my roses, a therapeutic ritual, when my daughter-in-law, Tiffany, emerged from the French doors of the garden-level apartment she shared with my son. She was in her third trimester, magnificent and swelling, and she carried her pregnancy before her like a royal scepter. "Patricia," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "we need to talk about this." She gestured at the garden, at the riot of color I had so carefully cultivated. "I've been consulting with a landscape designer," she announced. "He agrees with me. This whole cottage garden look is not only dated, it's completely impractical for a family with a newborn. The thorns, the bees, it's a minefield of potential hazards." I straightened up, my back aching. "Tiffany," I said calmly, "these are my roses. They were a gift from my late husband. They are not going anywhere." A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. My appeal to sentiment was a language she did not speak. "This isn't about sentiment, Patricia," she said, her voice sharp and condescending. "This is about safety. It's about creating a nurturing environment for my child. I have a vision for this space, a clean, safe, modern space." She held up a tablet displaying an image of a stark, gray, gravel-filled yard, as sterile and joyless as a prison courtyard. The sheer arrogance of it, the casual way she spoke of destroying something so precious to me, finally broke through my patience. "This is my property, Tiffany," I said, my voice now laced with a steel she had never heard. "You are not turning my garden into a gravel pit." In that moment of stunning, ringing silence, my world narrowed to a single point of focus. My son, Jamal, had been drawn out of the house by the sound of his wife's shouting. He was standing in the doorway, his face a mask of weary apprehension. This was it, the ultimate test of the system, the final audit of the social contract I had created for us. His wife had just launched a brutal, unforgivable assault on his mother. She had declared me a useless, unwanted presence in the very home that my generosity provided. As I waited for him to speak, the entire history of that generosity played out in my mind with a devastating clarity. I saw myself after my husband's death, selling our large family home and strategically purchasing this duplex not for my own benefit, but for theirs. I saw myself choosing the smaller, upstairs unit, so they could have the spacious two-bedroom garden apartment, a home they could never afford on their own. I saw the lease agreement that was never written, the contract of the heart that stipulated they would pay a mere $500 a month in a neighborhood where the market rate was over $3,000. $30,000 a year, that was the value of my gift. $30,000 of unearned, unacknowledged, and now utterly unappreciated financial freedom. That gift was the reason for their new SUV, for Tiffany's designer maternity clothes, for the Scandinavian crib that cost more than my first car. Their entire comfortable, curated life was a fiction, and I was its silent, invisible author. I had given them a life without financial worry, a foundation of security so absolute that they had forgotten it wasn't their own. They had mistaken the safety net for the ground beneath their feet, and in doing so they had come to see me, the weaver of that net, as nothing more than an inconvenient obstruction. This was his moment to remember. This was his moment to be a son, to be a man, to stand up and defend the woman who had not only given him life, but had given him this life. I looked at him, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. I did not need him to fight my battles. I only needed him to stand with me. I needed him to draw a line. I needed him to say, "That's enough. Tiffany, you will not speak to my mother that way." That was all it would have taken. A single sentence of loyalty, of decency. He looked at his wife, her face contorted with rage. He looked at me, my face a mask of stunned, wounded disbelief, and I saw him make the calculation. I saw him weigh the cost of his wife's continued fury against the cost of his mother's pain, and he chose the path of least resistance. He chose to appease the screaming tyrant in front of him rather than defend the silent, wounded woman who was his own flesh and blood. He sighed, a sound of profound, world-weary exasperation, as if I were the source of this conflict, as if my very presence were the problem. He walked over Tiffany and put a placating arm around her shoulders. He didn't even look at me when he spoke. He looked at a spot on the lawn somewhere between us, his voice a tired, dismissive mumble. "Don't be selfish, Mom," he said. The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. Selfish. Me, who had given them a life of subsidized ease. Me, who had taken the smaller apartment, who had changed my cooking habits, who had offered up my home and my heart. I was the selfish one, for wanting to keep my roses, for wanting a shred of respect, for simply wanting to exist. He wasn't finished. He finally turned his eyes to me, and they were not the eyes of my loving son. They were the cold, annoyed eyes of a stranger. "And don't be dramatic," he added. That was the end. That was the sound of the contract being irrevocably, permanently voided. My pain was not a valid emotion. It was drama. My desire for basic human dignity was not a reasonable expectation. It was selfishness. In 2 short, brutal sentences, my son had not only failed to defend me, he had actively taken my attacker's side. He had validated her cruelty. He had co-signed her assessment of me as a useless, dramatic, selfish old woman. The system was not just broken, it had been annihilated. And in the echoing silence that followed his words, a new system, a new contract was already beginning to form in my mind. A contract that did not include him. A strange and terrible calm descended upon me. The searing pain of their words, the profound soul-deep wound of my son's betrayal, did not send me into a spiral of grief or rage. Instead, it triggered a response that was deeply ingrained in my professional DNA. When faced with a catastrophic system failure, an administrator does not weep. She assesses. She analyzes and she acts. The emotional part of my brain, the part that was a mother, simply shut down. It was a clean surgical procedure. The part that remained was the administrator, the strategist, the woman who had spent a lifetime solving intractable problems with cold, clear and decisive action. I looked at them, at this united front of monstrous entitlement and weak, cowardly appeasement, and I no longer saw my family. I saw a failed project. I saw a liability that needed to be managed. I saw a contract that had been breached, and my mind with a chilling, dispassionate clarity began to calculate the terms of its dissolution. I straightened my back, pulling off my leather gardening gloves with a slow, deliberate motion. I looked directly at my son, my expression now completely unreadable, a blank slate from which all emotion had been wiped. "You're right, Jamal," I said, my voice as calm and even as if I were discussing a quarterly budget report. "I shouldn't be selfish." The quiet sincerity of my agreement seemed to unnerve them. It was not the reaction they had expected. They had been prepared for tears, for arguments, for the drama they had just accused me of. They were not prepared for my complete and total capitulation. A flicker of confusion, of uncertainty, crossed Jamal's face. Tiffany's look of furious triumph softened into a wary, suspicious frown. I continued, my voice maintaining its steady, professional tone. "This arrangement is clearly causing you both a great deal of stress, and the last thing I want to do is be a burden, especially at such an important time in your lives." I paused, letting the words sink in, letting them savor what they believed was their victory. "So I will move out," I said. The statement was delivered with no inflection, no hint of the monumental decision that lay behind it. It was a simple logistical statement of fact. Jamal's face flooded with a mixture of shock and, to my eternal disgust, a faint, unmistakable flicker of relief. "Mom, wait," he stammered, finally seeming to grasp the magnitude of what was happening. "I didn't mean you had to. I mean we can work this out." But his protest was weak, a pathetic, half-hearted gesture that was instantly overridden by his wife. Tiffany's face, on the other hand, was a blossoming flower of pure, unadulterated triumph. She was trying to conceal it, to maintain a facade of concerned solemnity, but she could not hide the victorious, predatory gleam in her eyes. She had won. She had driven the useless old woman out. The nest was now hers, and hers alone. Well, if you think it's for the best, Patricia, she said, her voice a symphony of false sympathy, we would never want you to feel uncomfortable. The hypocrisy was so profound, so breathtaking, that it was almost admirable. She was a true master of her dark manipulative art. I ignored her completely, my gaze remaining fixed on my son. There is nothing to work out, Jamal, I said, my voice leaving no room for negotiation. You have both made your positions very clear. You need your space, and I have been selfishly taking it up. It's a simple problem with a simple solution. I will be out by the end of the week. And with that, I turned my back on them. I walked away from my roses, away from the garden, and back towards the house. I did not storm off. I did not slam a door. I simply retreated. A strategic withdrawal from a battle that was already over. They had won the battle, but they had no idea that they had just handed me the justification, the mandate and the cold righteous fury to win the war. The social contract was void. It was time to consult the legal one. My withdrawal was not a retreat into grief. It was a mobilization. The moment I stepped back into the quiet sanctuary of my own apartment, the administrator took full command. The next few days were a blur of focused, efficient action, a logistical operation executed with the precision of a military campaign. I did not weep. I did not pace the floors. I compartmentalized the profound, ragged wound of my son's betrayal, and filed it away under to be processed at a later date. My immediate objective was clear: strategic relocation and asset liquidation. My home, this duplex that I had poured so much love and hope into, was now a compromised asset. It was tainted by the ugliness of what had happened, its emotional value completely stripped away. It was no longer a home, it was a property, a number on a balance sheet, and it was time to divest. I spent Monday morning on the phone, not with friends or family, but with professionals. My first call was to a high-end moving company, the best in the city. I scheduled a full-service pack and move for Friday. My second call was to a short-term luxury rental agency. I secured a beautiful, fully furnished one-bedroom apartment in a modern downtown high-rise, a place with a concierge, a gym and a stunning view of the city skyline. It was a neutral space, a temporary command center from which I could plan my next move. My third and most important call was to Eleanor Vance, the top real estate agent in the city, a woman known for her aggressive tactics and her ability to close deals with lightning speed. Eleanor, I said, my voice all business. It's Patricia Hayes. I have a prime duplex in Crestwood Park that I need to sell, and I need it sold by the end of the week. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. Patricia, she said, her voice laced with a mixture of surprise and professional excitement. That's an aggressive timeline. I'm looking for an all-cash buyer, someone who can waive inspections and close immediately, I continued, ignoring her comment. The upper unit will be delivered vacant. Friday arrived, a day of quiet, methodical finality. The moving truck, a large gleaming white vehicle, pulled up to the curb at precisely 9 a.m., just as scheduled. The crew was professional, efficient, and discreet. They moved through my small apartment with a practiced, silent grace, wrapping furniture, packing boxes, and systematically erasing all traces of my existence from the space. Downstairs I could hear the faint sounds of Jamal and Tiffany's life, the murmur of their television, the clatter of dishes in their kitchen. They were undoubtedly aware of what was happening, and I could almost feel their smug, triumphant satisfaction radiating up through the floorboards. They had won. The useless old woman was being carted away, leaving them in sole possession of their kingdom. I spent the morning in my now empty living room, sitting on a single remaining dining chair, sipping a cup of tea from a paper cup. I was not sad. I was not nostalgic. I was an administrator, overseeing the final phase of a complex logistical operation. Each box that was carried out, each piece of furniture that disappeared down the stairs, was a step towards my own liberation. At one point, Jamal came upstairs. He knocked softly on the open door, his expression a carefully constructed mask of filial concern. "Hey Mom," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Do you need any help with anything?" I looked at him, at this stranger who wore my son's face, and I felt nothing but a cool, distant pity. He was like a man offering to help rearrange the deck chairs on a ship he didn't realize was sinking. "No thank you, Jamal," I said, my voice polite and utterly devoid of emotion. "The professionals have it well in hand." He lingered in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable, searching for the right words, the right gesture to absolve him of his guilt. "Look Mom," he began. "About the other day, Tiffany was just stressed. Her hormones, we didn't mean for you to actually leave. It was a pathetic, transparent attempt to rewrite history, to reframe their brutal eviction of me as a simple misunderstanding. I did not give him the satisfaction of an argument. I simply looked at him, my gaze as steady and as unreadable as a stone wall. You both made your wishes perfectly clear, I said, and I am honoring them. It's for the best. The finality in my voice, the complete absence of the maternal warmth he had taken for granted his entire life, finally seemed to register. A flicker of real, genuine fear crossed his face. This was not the reaction of a dramatic, emotional mother who could be placated with a few empty words. This was something else entirely, something he did not recognize and did not know how to handle. He mumbled something about Tiffany needing him and retreated back downstairs, back to the comfort of his own ignorance. The movers finished their work by early afternoon. I did a final walkthrough of the empty apartment, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was just a space now, a collection of rooms, stripped of all meaning, all history. It held no power over me. I walked down the stairs and out the front door for the last time. As I stood on the sidewalk waiting for the car I had ordered to take me to my new temporary home, I took one last look at the handsome brick building. It was no longer my home. It was no longer my investment. It was simply an asset that had been successfully liquidated. Jamal and Tiffany were inside, celebrating their newfound privacy, completely oblivious to the fact that the very ground beneath their feet had just been sold. They had no idea that their quiet, subsidized world was about to be hit by a Category 5 hurricane. And I, the woman they had deemed useless, had just single-handedly orchestrated the storm. I imagine that Saturday morning was, for them, a portrait of domestic bliss. The first full day of their new mother-in-law-free existence. The dawn of a new era. I can see it with a cinematic clarity. The sun would have been streaming through the French doors of the garden-level apartment, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The smell of freshly brewed, expensive coffee would have filled the spacious kitchen. Jamal would have been at the dining table, sketching on his tablet, a look of profound, unburdened peace on his face. The constant, low-grade tension of the past few months, the stress of navigating the delicate, impossible dance between his wife and his mother, was finally gone. He was free. Tiffany would have been in what was to be the nursery, a can of organic, non-toxic paint in one hand, a color swatch in the other. She would have been humming to herself, a soft, contented sound. Her nest was finally hers. The intrusive, judgmental presence that had been contaminating her perfect vision was gone. There would be no more unsolicited advice, no more disapproving glances, no more arguments over the placement of a crib or the color of a wall. The space was a blank canvas, and she was the sole artist. They would have talked about their future, their voices full of a renewed, unclouded optimism. They would have planned the final details of the baby shower. They would have discussed turning my old rose garden into their sterile, gravel-covered zenscape. They would have marveled at their good fortune, at the beauty and the spaciousness of their home, a home they had through some magical act of cognitive dissonance come to believe was truly their own. They would have felt a profound sense of relief, the sweet, intoxicating release of a problem that has been permanently solved. They were the king and queen of their castle, and they had finally mercifully banished the old queen mother to a distant, irrelevant land. Their peace, however, was a fragile, foolish thing, a house of cards built on a foundation of profound and willful ignorance. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They had assumed my retreat was an emotional act, the wounded response of a spurned mother. They had failed to understand that it was a strategic one, the calculated move of a seasoned administrator. They had forgotten the fundamental nature of our relationship. I was not just their mother, I was their landlady, and the house they saw as their home was, in the cold, hard language of the law, a property, an asset I no longer owned. And the new owner, the embodiment of the real world they had been so blissfully, ignorantly sheltered from, was about to introduce himself. The knock came at precisely 10 a.m. I imagined the sun was streaming through the French doors, the smell of coffee was in the air, and they were in the midst of planning their perfect child-filled future in their perfect mother-in-law-free home. The doorbell would have been an unwelcome interruption. Jamal, probably annoyed at the disturbance, would have opened the door to find a tall, impeccably dressed man standing on his doorstep. A man with a polished briefcase, a crisp suit, and an air of calm, unassailable authority. He would not have recognized him. He would have assumed he was a salesman, a neighbor, perhaps someone collecting for a charity. "Can I help you?" Jamal would have asked, his tone a mixture of politeness and impatience. The man would have extended a hand, his smile professional but devoid of any warmth. "Good morning," he would have said, his voice a smooth, pleasant baritone. "My name is Franklin Sterling." Jamal would have shaken his hand, a puzzled look on his face. The name meant nothing to him. "And you are?" The man's smile would not have wavered. He would have delivered the next line with a devastating, dispassionate simplicity, a line that would have instantly shattered their perfect, tranquil morning into a million pieces. "I am the new owner of the property." The silence that followed Mr. Sterling's statement must have been a thing of profound, earth-shattering density. I can see the scene as if I were a fly on the wall. The slow, dawning horror on my son's face as his brain struggled to process the information. The way his polite, welcoming smile would have frozen, then crumbled into a mask of disbelief. He would have stared at this stranger, this impeccably dressed man who was claiming ownership of his home, and he would have felt the first cold tendrils of a panic he had never known before. Tiffany, drawn to the door by the sudden silence, would have appeared behind him, her hand on her hip, an annoyed, impatient look on her face. "Who is it, honey?" she would have asked. And then she would have seen the look on her husband's face, and her own expression would have shifted from annoyance to alarm. Mr. Sterling, a man clearly accustomed to being in control of any situation, would not have waited for them to recover. He was not there to socialize. He was there to do business. He would have opened his polished briefcase with a soft, authoritative click. "Perhaps it would be better if we discussed this inside," he would have suggested, his tone polite but firm. The tone of a man who was not asking for permission, but stating a fact. Numbly, my son would have stepped aside, allowing this stranger to enter the home he had just moments before believed was his castle. They would have stood in the living room, the room they had so recently reclaimed as their own, and they would have listened as Miss Sterling, in a calm, professional and utterly implacable voice, laid out the new reality of their lives. They would have stood in the living room, the room that had been the stage for their triumphant victory, just the day before, and they would have listened as Mr. Sterling, in a calm, professional and utterly implacable voice, laid out the new reality of their lives. He would have explained that he had purchased the property from the previous owner, a Mrs. Patricia Hayes, in an all-cash transaction that had closed the previous day. He would have presented them with a copy of the deed, the official notarized document that proved his ownership beyond any shadow of a doubt. And then, he would have gotten to the heart of the matter. "I've reviewed the tenancy records for the property," he would have said, his eyes scanning a document he had pulled from his briefcase. "And it seems the arrangement for this unit was informal, a verbal, month-to-month agreement with the previous owner. Unfortunately, under state law, such an agreement does not transfer with the sale of the property. From a legal standpoint, your previous lease is now null and void." Each word would have been a hammer blow, systematically demolishing the foundations of their world. The home they had taken for granted, the life they had assumed was their right, was being stripped away from them, not with anger or emotion, but with the cold, unassailable logic of contract law. They were not homeowners. They were not even secure tenants. They were, in the eyes of the law and its new representative, Mr. Franklin Sterling, simply occupants, and their occupancy was about to become very, very expensive. Mr. Sterling would have then placed two documents on their coffee table, side by side. As the new owner, he would have continued, his voice a model of professional detachment, "I am prepared to offer you two options." He would have tapped the first document. "This is a standard, one-year lease agreement for this unit. As you know, Crestwood Park is a highly desirable neighborhood, and the market rate for a two-bedroom garden-level apartment of this size is $3,200 a month. I'm prepared to offer it to you for an even $3,000, with the first month's rent and a security deposit of the same amount due upon signing." The number $3,000 would have hung in the air, a monstrous, impossible figure. It was 6 times what they were used to pay. It was a sum that would have instantly consumed the majority of Jamal's monthly income, leaving them with nothing for their car payment, their credit card bills, their expensive baby furniture. It was not a rent payment, it was a death sentence for the lifestyle they had so carefully constructed. And then, Mr. Sterling would have tapped the second document. "Your other option," he would have said, his voice unchanging, "is this. This is a legal 60-day notice to vacate the premise. My intention is to undertake a significant renovation of both units, after which I may choose occupy one of them myself. If you are unable to sign the new lease, you will have 60 days to find alternative housing. The choice," he would have concluded, a faint final smile on his lips, "is entirely yours." The eruption that followed Mr. Sterling's calm, devastating presentation would have been immediate and volcanic. The initial shock would have given way to a tidal wave of panic, rage, and disbelief. Tiffany, I am certain, would have been the first to break. Her carefully constructed world, her perfect nest, her entire identity as a soon-to-be mother living an aspirational lifestyle, had just been obliterated. The armor of her pregnancy, the weapon she had wielded with such devastating effect against me, would have been useless against the cold, hard shield of the law. I can hear her voice rising in a shrill, hysterical shriek. You can't do this. This is our home. We live here. My mother-in-law, Patricia. She would never allow this. Jamal, his face pale with a terror he had likely never known, would have echoed her, his voice a desperate, pleading stammer. There must be a mistake. My mom owns this house. She wouldn't just sell it, not without telling us. She just moved out yesterday. Mr. Sterling, a man who had undoubtedly dealt with countless emotional tenants in his long career, would have remained completely unmoved. He would have listened to their frantic protests with an air of patient, professional detachment, waiting for the storm to pass. I can assure you there is no mistake, he would have said, his voice a calm, steady anchor in their sea of panic. The sale was perfectly legal and has been officially recorded with the city. Mrs. Hayes is no longer the owner. I am, and as the owner, I am acting entirely within my legal rights. His dispassionate recitation of the facts would have only fueled their desperation. They would have been like drowning people, grasping at any piece of driftwood they could find. They would have insisted he call me, that I would clear this all up, that this was all a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. Mr. Sterling would have politely but firmly declined. My business is with you, the current occupants, he would have said. My communications with Mrs. Hayes concluded with the closing of the sale. The property, and by extension its tenants, are now my responsibility. The finality of his words, the cold, bureaucratic wall he erected between them and me, would have been the moment they finally truly understood. I was not going to save them. I was the one who had, in their eyes, condemned them. The realization would have sent a new, more focused wave of panic through them. The enemy was no longer the calm, implacable man in their living room. It was me. The phone calls would have started almost immediately. The first call would have come while Miss Sterling was still there, a frantic, desperate attempt to prove him wrong, to summon me back to fix the world they had broken. It would have gone straight to my voicemail, as my son's number was now, and would forever remain, blocked. Mr. Sterling would have left them then, a quiet, professional departure from a scene of total emotional carnage. He would have left the 2 documents on their coffee table, a stark, black and white representation of their impossible choice. And in the ringing silence of his absence, the true siege would have begun. It was a siege of their own making, a desperate, frantic assault on the fortress of silence I had erected around myself. The phone calls, having failed to connect, would have been replaced by a torrent of text messages, each one a digital flare sent up from a sinking ship. I was in my new apartment, a quiet, sunlit space high above the city, when the first messages began to arrive. I did not read them immediately. I let them accumulate, a growing testament to their escalating panic. I imagined their state of mind with a cool, dispassionate clarity. The initial wave of rage and disbelief would be giving way to a colder, more terrifying emotion, the dawning realization of their own catastrophic stupidity. They would be pacing the beautiful hardwood floors of their apartment, the very floors they had so recently celebrated, reclaiming, and they would be seeing them now not as a symbol of their victory, but as the deck of the Titanic. The first volley of texts I knew would be angry, accusatory, an attempt to shift the blame, to cast me as the villain in a story where they were the innocent victims. How could you do this to us? You sold our home from under us. Tiffany is pregnant. Are you trying to kill her with stress? I could almost hear Jamal's voice in those words, the pathetic, self-pitying tone of a man who has never had to take true responsibility for his own life. The next wave of messages, probably coming an hour or 2 later after the initial adrenaline had worn off and the sheer crushing weight of a $3,000 rent payment had begun to settle in, would have shifted in tone. The anger would have begun to curdle into a kind of desperate, manipulative pleading. Mom, please call me. We made a mistake. Tiffany didn't mean what she said. She's not well. We'll do anything. We'll apologize. Just call Mr. Sterling and tell him to stop. Please. We have nowhere to go. This would be Tiffany's work. The classic maneuver of a narcissist who, when confronted with the consequences of their own actions, immediately reframes themselves as the victim. The pregnancy, once a weapon of entitlement, was now a shield of vulnerability. The cruelty she had so casually dispensed was now being dismissed as an unfortunate symptom of a medical condition. It was a predictable and a pathetic performance. I let the hours tick by. I made myself a cup of tea. I read a chapter of my book. I watched the sun begin to set over the city, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, and all the while my phone buzzed and chimed, a relentless, desperate chorus of their self-inflicted misery. The siege continued throughout the night and into the next day. The messages became more frequent, more frantic, more unhinged. They would have spent the night sleepless, the two impossible documents on their coffee table radiating a kind of dark energy into the room. They would have argued, their fear and panic turning into bitter, ugly recrimination. Tiffany would have blamed Jamal for not having a better job, for not being able to afford the new rent. Jamal would have blamed Tiffany for her monstrous behavior, for having provoked the mother whose generosity had been the sole pillar of their comfortable lives. Their perfect nest would have become a war zone. By Sunday afternoon, the tone of the messages would have devolved completely into abject, pathetic begging. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was a terrible son. Please forgive. Don't do this to us. Don't do this to your grandchild." This was the final stage of their grief. A desperate, hollow bargaining. It was the sound of a man who had finally, belatedly understood the true value of what he had lost. But his apology was not born of genuine remorse. It was born of terror. It was not a change of heart. It was a desperate attempt to reverse a transaction he had just realized was a catastrophic mistake. It was too little, and it was far, far too late. I let them marinate in their self-inflicted panic for 2 full days. I did not need to see their frantic texts or hear their desperate voicemails to know the shape of their terror. I had designed the system and I knew exactly how it would function. I had removed their safety net and I was now allowing them to experience the dizzying, terrifying sensation of a free fall. My silence was not a passive act. It was an active, strategic choice. It was a necessary part of the process, a period of quarantine to allow the full consequences of their actions to incubate. Every unanswered call, every unread text was a reinforcement of the new reality. I was no longer their mother, the soft place to fall, the ever-present, all-forgiving source of their comfort. I was a closed account, a terminated contract. The woman they had known, the useless old woman they had so casually and cruelly dismissed, no longer existed. In her place was a stranger, a distant, unreachable figure who had made a business decision and moved on. On Monday morning, after 48 hours of what I can only imagine was a living hell for them, I decided the lesson had been sufficiently absorbed. It was time to deliver the final, official communiqué. I did not call them. To speak to them would be to open the door to a negotiation I had no intention of having. A voice can carry false notes of sympathy, of hesitation. I needed a medium that was as cold, as clear, and as unambiguous as my decision. I chose a text message. It was a medium of finality, a digital stone tablet on which the new laws of our relationship would be carved. I composed the message with the same care I would have used to draft a final notice of termination to a problematic employee. Every word was chosen for its precise legalistic and emotional weight. It was not a message from a mother to her son. It was a message from a property owner to a former tenant. The message read, "Jamal, I have received your messages. To be clear, you and Tiffany asked me to move out of my home, and I did. You called me selfish, so I made a financial decision that was in my own best interest. That is the opposite of selfish. It is prudent. The duplex has been sold. The new owner, Mr. Franklin Sterling, is now your legal point of contact for all housing matters. I wish you the best in your future endeavors." I read the message twice, ensuring its tone was perfect. It was a masterpiece of cold, irrefutable logic. It took their own words, their own accusations, and turned them back on them, not as weapons but as simple statements of fact. It was a mirror reflecting the ugly truth of their own actions. I had not acted out of malice. I had simply honored their request. I had not been cruel. I had been prudent. I had not abandoned them. I had simply moved on just as they had demanded. The final line, "I wish you the best in your future endeavors," was the coldest of all. It was the sterile corporate sign-off one gives to a stranger, a final formal severing of all personal ties. I hit send, and then with a sense of profound, cleansing finality, I went into my phone settings and blocked his number, Tiffany's number, and the numbers of any of their friends who they might have tried to use as intermediaries. The drawbridge was up. The communication lines were cut. The system was now perfectly, beautifully, and permanently closed. The months that followed were a period of quiet, joyful reconstruction. I had divested myself of a toxic asset, and my own portfolio. My life was thriving as a result. The luxurious modern apartment I had rented downtown was meant to be a temporary solution, but I found that I adored it. It was a space that was entirely my own, a clean slate with no memories, no ghosts, no lingering resentments. It was a fortress of peace, high above the noise of the city, with a panoramic view that seemed to stretch on into infinity. The profits from the sale of the duplex had been substantial, and I used them to purchase the apartment outright, and then I invested the rest with a renewed sense of purpose. I was no longer investing for a future that included my son. I was investing in my own. I traveled. I took a cooking class. I volunteered on the board of a local arts organization. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who had been subtly pushed to the margins by the demands of my small insular family life. I was building a new system, a new life, one that was richer, fuller, and far more peaceful than the one I had left behind. The news of Jamal and Tiffany's fate trickled back to me as such news always does, through the quiet informal network of mutual acquaintances. I never asked for information, but it was offered in hushed sympathetic tones by friends who were trying to gauge my emotional state. I learned that they had of course been unable to afford the new rent at the duplex. They had been forced to take the 60-day notice to vacate, their frantic, desperate search for affordable housing in a city with a brutal rental market, all while Tiffany was in the final, most uncomfortable weeks of her pregnancy, had been a grueling, humiliating ordeal. They had been forced to swallow their pride and appeal to Tiffany's parents, who had reluctantly allowed them to move into their small, finished basement. The spacious, sunlit, garden-level apartment had been replaced by a cramped subterranean room with a single high window. The dream of a perfect minimalist nursery was gone, replaced by a crib and a changing table crammed into a corner of a damp, poorly lit room. Their beautiful, curated life had been exposed for what it was, a fragile illusion, a fantasy that had been entirely dependent on the generosity of the useless old woman they had so cruelly cast out. Their marriage, I was told, was crumbling under the weight of their new reality. The financial stress was a constant, grinding pressure. The blame and recrimination were a poison that had seeped into the foundations of their relationship. Tiffany, stripped of the comfortable lifestyle she believed was her birthright, had become bitter and resentful, and Jamal, stripped of his role as the successful provider, a role he had only ever been playing with my money, was a broken, defeated man. They had gotten what they wanted. They had their privacy. They had a life completely free of me, and it was a miserable, cramped, and financially desperate life. I felt a pang of something when I heard this news. It was not joy. It was not triumph. It was a profound, aching sadness. A sadness for the son I had loved, the good, kind boy who had gotten lost somewhere along the way. A sadness for my grandchild, a baby who was being born into a world of stress and resentment, a world created by the folly and greed of its own parents. But beneath the sadness, there was a bedrock of calm, unshakable certainty. I had done the right thing. I had not caused their ruin. I had simply stopped financing their illusion. I had held them accountable for their own choices. I had enforced the terms of a contract that they and they alone had broken. My revenge was not in their misery. My revenge was in my peace. It was in the quiet, sunlit mornings in my new home, a cup of coffee in my hand, the city spread out before me like a kingdom of possibilities. It was in the freedom, the lightness, the profound, unshakable sense of a system restored to its proper logical order. They had tried to declare me useless, to write me out of their story, but I had proven that I was the author of my own story, the administrator of my own life, and I had written them out of mine. I was no longer a mother-in-law, no longer a landlady, no longer a safety net. I was Patricia Hayes, a retired hospital administrator, a woman of means, a traveler, a volunteer, a friend. I was the architect of a new system, a system designed for one, and it was the most peaceful, the most stable, the most satisfying system I had ever built. The contract was with myself, and its terms were simple: to live the remainder of my life with dignity, with purpose, and with the quiet, unshakable joy of a woman who had finally, mercifully and completely, reclaimed her own peace.